My run today starts here at the Horniman Museum. This rather imposing clock tower, in all its softly rounded solidity, is a beacon for Forest Hill, the southeast London district that I call home. This mosaic, which has adorned the side of the museum since its opening in 1901, features 11 figures, each one the personification of a concept or value central to the vision that founder Frederick Horniman claimed to have built his public collection on. At the centre stands humanity. The Horniman Museum boasts an impressively eclectic collection of objects from cultures around the world. As you can see, it's surrounded by beautifully maintained gardens. The gardens offer an ideal space to run through, or walk through, or simply to chill. This is a place where people gather. On a warm weekend, these gardens are abuzz with human life, as well as plant life, and, as is always encouraging to see, some insect life. It's a popular spot for families. There's no shortage of signs of the work that goes into looking after these gardens, whether it's the regular sight of workers tending to plants or evidence of construction, testament to the ever-evolving needs of this public space. I do want to talk a little bit more about the history of the Horniman Museum and its founder. I have actually read a whole book on this subject, Mr. Horniman's Walrus by Clare Paterson, which was a really thoughtful leaving gift from a former colleague. So thank you, Simon. Shout out to Simon. The walrus alluded to in the title of that book is a stuffed walrus that's an icon of the Horniman Museum. It sits pride of place within the collection of taxidermy animals, though actually at time of recording is not on display. I think that gallery's getting a new look, and I must say I did always find it a little bit fusty in there. The walrus is striking for being huge, smooth, and balloon-like, unlike live walruses that are wrinklier, craggier, and have folds in their skin. This walrus's taxidermist clearly was unaware of this, as they stretched the skin out tightly over the frame, leaving it taut, wrinkleless. The museum's ethnographic collection comprises approximately 80,000 objects from around the world, according to its website. This public collection sprang from the private collection of Frederick Horniman, who made a fortune back in the Victorian era from the tea business that he inherited from his father. Frederick travelled the world to acquire these objects. He saw himself as a philanthropist, using his wealth to procure items he saw as exotic so that they could be displayed here in Forest Hill in an effort to educate the masses. Like the majority of men of his social standing in Britain during this age of empire, Frederick's worldview was steeped in imperialist ideology. Clare Paterson puts it like this: "The Museum for Frederick reflected global complexity and Britain's naturally superior place. He was a man whose business spanned the empire, but had Britain at its heart. Newspapers reviewing the collection admired it because they saw home as a civilizing influence, in contrast to the foreign objects on display. It represented order out of chaos, progress out of primitivism." I've now stepped on to the Horniman Nature Trail, a green woodland corridor that runs alongside the gardens and is managed by the museum. This trail follows the path of a railway line, defunct since the 1950s, that continued down to Crystal Palace, the destination of our jog today. The Crystal Palace was a major tourist attraction. 2 million visitors flocked there every year, and the railway was constructed to accommodate them. Frederick himself first visited the palace as a child and returned again and again throughout his life. It had a formative influence on him and was undoubtedly what inspired him to start amassing his own collection. Displayed within the palace were ethnographical dioramas that featured stuffed animals and were designed to illustrate life in different parts of the world. Interest in ancient Egypt was particularly in vogue at the time, and the palace's Egyptian court was particularly renowned. Frederick's own interest in Egypt is well documented. In fact, one of the most shocking tales that I learned from reading Clare Paterson's book comes from one of Frederick Horniman's first forays into sharing his collection with the public. The public were invited to come and witness the live unravelling of a 3,000-year-old mummy. That's right, it was here in Forest Hill that, in front of a gawking audience, the bandages were unwound and the human remains within exposed. Today the Horniman is a different kind of museum. It has stayed true to that Victorian belief in the civic necessity of museums as places where the public should feel welcomed, to be educated and entertained. Its managers and curators have strived to make amends for the wrongs that tarnish the collection they've inherited. In 2021, the Horniman became the first museum in the UK to repatriate the handful of Benin bronzes that were in its possession, originally stolen by British forces from the Kingdom of Benin in an act of punitive colonial aggression. Today, says Clare Paterson, the Horniman collection is understood to be more about what peoples have in common than what sets them apart. Museums constantly reinterpret the world from their own perspective in time, and visitors in the 1890s would have brought a very different mindset to the collection. Forest Hill is certainly true to its name. I've got a little bit of a climb ahead of me here. Forest Hill and its neighbouring districts of Sydenham and Crystal Palace are home to a cluster of peaks that are among the only points in London over 100 metres above sea level. As for the forest, well, you'll soon see where that part of the name comes from. We're heading into the largest surviving pocket of the Great North Wood, an ancient woodland that once covered a huge swathe of what are now the residential suburbs of South London. I've now stepped into Sydenham Hill Woods, which adjoins Dulwich Woods. Together they make up a pretty decent-sized woodland, big enough to feel secluded amongst the trees, protected from the surrounding urban landscape at any rate. I'm now crossing over Cox's Walk footbridge, which has been recently restored. The bridge originally crossed over the aforementioned disused railway line, whose former path I've been closely following. In the decades since the railway was scrapped, the trees have taken back control. This shows us how the recent history of these woods is as much one of reclamation as it is preservation. Much of the land that I'll run over as I pass through these woods has been reclaimed, not only from the railway, but also from private back gardens of big hillside houses with affluent owners, houses that have since crumbled into oblivion. Perhaps the best illustration of the forest's comeback comes from this painting by French Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro. It's a painting of his view from where he was sat on Cox's Walk footbridge, the bridge that I ran over a moment ago. Today, the train station and the railway that he paints are gone. Today, when we look from Cox's Walk footbridge, all we see are trees. The woodland provides a habitat for wildlife that at one time would have been found all across the Great North Wood. A book that I love, and which has inspired a number of high-quality stomps that I've undertaken around London, is London is a Forest, by the aptly named Paul Wood. Paul Wood tells us about some of the birds that can be spotted here in Dulwich and Sydenham Hill Woods. You might hear, he says, and if you're lucky, see great spotted woodpeckers. There are nuthatches, tree creepers and sparrowhawks too. In the summer, early risers are rewarded with fantastic dawn choruses, and in recent years, hobbies, small swift falcons have bred here, and tiny but striking firecrests have also been seen. Sydenham Hill Wood is managed by the London Wildlife Trust, a charity that champions and maintains nature reserves around the capital. You can see that I'm actually approaching a representative of the London Wildlife Trust, probably a volunteer. who's spending his Saturday patiently stationed here on this footpath, trying to attract the attention of passers-by in order to talk about the work that the Trust does and maybe get some donations. After I'd finished this run, I actually walked back the way I'd come and got chatting to this guy whose name was either Peter or Paul, I can't quite remember which. And he told me that Sydenham Hill Woods was actually the London Wildlife Trust's first nature reserve. They took over the management of these woods back in 1982. This was in response to plans to develop here. Paul Wood says, an unprecedented number of local residents were galvanised into action and succeeded in halting the building. The community has been deeply involved in caring for and simply enjoying the wood ever since. Just leaving Sydenham Hill Woods now and stepping out onto Crescent Wood Road, which I follow until it meets Sydenham Hill, which I cross before heading down Wells Park Road. I'm turning off Wells Park Road and into Sydenham Wells Park, a highly pleasant park, it must be said. I find that every park in London has a story, and this one is no exception. Sydenham Wells Park is named after, as the name suggests, some wells that people would come to specifically in order to draw from them water which was purported to have medicinal qualities. The ground here is made up of just a thin layer of London clay, underneath which is water very high in magnesium sulfate, a type of magnesium sulfate that we call Epsom salt. That's what people came here for, even though it would have tasted pretty rotten, but people thought it was good for them. I mean, it probably didn't actually have any health advantages, but that's sort of beside the point. There's records of people coming to these wells hoping to find a cure for their ills way back in the 17th century. If you look just on my left, there's a rock marking the location of one of those wells. Today it's easy to run past without paying too much attention to it, but when it was first placed there, it would have been an eye-catching sparkly green. In the intervening years, it's been victim to weathering. The writer Daniel Defoe wrote of coming to Sydenham Wells in the 1720s and seeing great crowds of people thronging to drink the waters. He compares the scene to those you'd find at Tunbridge and Epsom, towns also famous for their medicinal waters. However, Epsom and Tunbridge would be destinations for the rich, nobility and wealthy merchants who would go for the company, for the entertainment, to make a little holiday out of it. Here, in contrast, you would find crowds of common people, driven by genuine hope or desperation, seeking some respite from the suffering brought on by illnesses and ailments that so afflicted the lower classes of London in Defoe's day. I must say a big thank you to the London Geodiversity Partnership, and in particular the late Paul Rainey, the author of A Geotrail, Spas, Springs and Wells in South London, a document that I found online and which was incredibly helpful as a source of information for this little segment in Sydenham Wells Park. So I've crossed over Westwood Hill and I'm now travelling along Charleville Circus, a road that is, rather unusually, a perfect circle. These houses were built in the late 19th century on top of a former brick field. So that was a place where bricks would have been fired, made using the locally abundant London clay. It's London clay that gives the yellowish-brown hue to lots of the buildings round here, including these ones. Here we are, we've reached Crystal Palace Park, which we're entering through the Fisherman's Gate entrance on Crystal Palace Park Road. Crystal Palace Park, one of South London's most visited, best loved, and most unique parks. The park as we know it began life in the 1850s, when it was developed as grounds to surround the newly relocated Crystal Palace. Since then, the park has undergone many changes, many transformations, not least because the Crystal Palace itself is long gone. More on that a little bit later. The park today has a lot to offer. During the summer months, concerts are held here. You might be able to make out ahead a rust-coloured metallic structure that's just to my right. That's the back of the stage that artists perform on. Notably, this was the site of Bob Marley's last ever London concert in 1980. I've never actually been to a concert here myself, but there have been occasions in the past where I've just about been able to make out music, the sound coming from Crystal Palace, and I've been able to just about hear it all the way over in Forest Hill where I live. Or if an artist is going big on the visuals, lights, lasers, I have at times been able to see from where I live. To my left there is a lake, but you can tell from the foliage and the fencing in the way that they don't want the public getting too close to it. That's a fishing lake, but it's private. You've got to be a member to access it. So you'll see that there's quite a lot of evidence of work underway here at Crystal Palace Park. Various areas are closed off with this bright reddy orange fencing. That's because a huge regeneration project is underway, with work taking place at lots of different places all around the park. For instance, what I believe we're seeing here is the construction of a brand new visitor centre. I know there's a new playground on its way as well. Obviously, the work that's underway does change the appearance of some parts of the park and limits access to some areas. I did question whether it was a good idea to come film this while this was all going on. Wondered if maybe it would be better to wait, but then I thought, well, this is part of the park's story, and anyway, it's going to be many months before the work is complete, so I decided to just go for it anyway. Ooh, and would you look at that, we've reached another body of water. This one's a little bit more welcoming, a little bit more inviting for your average member of the public. You can actually hire a pedalo and go boating on this one. Okay, we've now arrived at a really interesting area of the park. Get ready to see some prehistoric animals. We've got some Irish elk there, the first of a number of statues of extinct creatures that can be found dotted along this path and along the banks of the lake. Unveiled back in 1854, these statues were a global first. They were the first full-scale representations of extinct animals to be produced anywhere in the world. Paleontology is the study of fossils, and the science of using them to generate our best guess of what ancient life would have looked like. In the mid-19th century, this field was still relatively young, but lots of exciting discoveries had been made over the last few decades, and interest in the fantastic beasts that experts claimed once walked the earth was only growing stronger. Crystal Palace's geological court was therefore an attempt to capitalise on this interest. The result? An innovatively immersive educational attraction. Ooh, somebody's put blankets over the Anaplotheriums. The Paleotherium statue there you can tell is more modern. That's because the original sculpture is one of at least 7 that have unaccountably gone missing. Yeah, a few of these statues have disappeared in mysterious circumstances over the years. One presumes that people have just nicked them. I wonder if those lost sculptures have found their way onto a very niche black market. As we approach the dinosaurs, I do want to shout out Mark Witton, whose online presentation on the history of these creations was really helpful. He has co-authored a book with Ellinor Michel, The Art and Science of the Crystal Palace Dinosaurs. Proceeds from sales go towards the dinosaurs' conservation. On my right is a model intended to illustrate geological strata, layers of rock that build up over time, showing how fossils can be dated based on the stratum or layer of rock in which they're found. Rocks from the relevant geological era were placed near to each of the creatures to illustrate the link between geology and paleontology. However, as the Crystal Palace initially had a policy of no signs carrying information, this might have been lost on most visitors. And the famous Megalosaurus is peeking out from behind the fence there. Of course, the statue, designed by Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, looks quite different what we now believe the Megalosaurus looked like. That can be said for a few of the dinosaurs that are on display, and the information plaques that are now to be found along this trail feature little illustrations that show what we now think these creatures looked like. If your reaction is to scoff at the mistakes made in this early attempt to reconstruct ancient life, I think you're missing the point somewhat. In a lot of cases, the statues are based on very scant fossil evidence, just a few bones, so a lot of guesswork needed, naturally, to fill in the gaps. But even today, paleontology is ultimately based a lot of the time on guesswork. We just have more evidence to use, so our guesses have got better. Personally, I find the signs of guesswork, later shown to be misjudged, to be a huge part of what makes this site fascinating. It's a valuable snapshot of the scientific process in action, showing how understanding shifts over time. That being said, there were apparently some paleontologists even at the time who were critical of the designs because they felt excessive speculation had gone into them. So there you go. Mark Witton, on the other hand, admires the statues for the plausibility of their designs based on the evidence that was available. He's also complimentary of the way that they're presented, dynamically, presenting realistic behaviours. He credits Waterhouse Hawkins with giving his creatures detailed, rich and realistic skin textures, however speculative they may be. So, when you hear the words Crystal Palace, what is the first thing you think of? I reckon for a lot of people the answer to that question is going to be Crystal Palace FC, the football club. And in fact, when the club was first founded, they did play their games in a stadium overlooked by the namesake Crystal Palace. That football ground was also where the FA Cup final was held for 20 years, starting in 1895. The club vacated these premises during the First World War. Today, the National Sports Centre stands where that football stadium once stood. And to my left, through the fence, can you see those goats? Don't know how well you can see them, but I promise you there's goats in there. They belong to Capel Manor College, a place that runs lots of vocational courses where you can learn things like animal management, environmental conservation, I think maybe horticulture, forestry and that kind of thing as well. The sort of stuff that I wish I knew how to do, basically. Alright, last stretch of the run, not too long to go now. I've got a good view here of Crystal Palace Transmitting Station. It's been there since the 1950s and is the main television transmitter for the whole of Greater London. Beneath it, you should be able to see, barricaded behind those orange fences that we've seen a lot of on our tour of the park today, the ornate terraces that tell us that we are now looking at the exact spot on which the Crystal Palace once stood. This wasn't the original home of the Crystal Palace. It was first erected over in Hyde Park to house the Great Exhibition in 1851. The Great Exhibition is considered a World's Fair, or international exhibition, in which a massive and mixed panoply of inventions, artifacts, and artworks from around the world were displayed within the Crystal Palace for half a year to crowds of visitors numbering in the tens of thousands every day. Many World's Fairs have taken place in different world cities since, but the 1851 Great Exhibition is generally accepted to be the first. Talking in general terms about what the Great Exhibition represented is somewhat tricky given its scale and the variety of exhibits within, but its most explicit aim was to make clear to the world Britain's role as a global leader in industry. Machines for making fabrics, machines for making steel, machines for making envelopes were on display next to telescopes, early cameras, and the world's first flushing toilets. After the Great Exhibition concluded, the Crystal Palace was taken down and then rebuilt, here. It was a structure of glass. It had a cast iron frame, but other than that was made almost entirely of glass. Almost 300,000 panes of glass were used in its construction, so it had a very striking appearance. The architect Joseph Paxton had in fact initially made a name for himself designing greenhouses and conservatories. It remained here as a popular, permanent tourist attraction until it was destroyed in a fire in 1936. Within this new Crystal Palace were great courts dedicated to the ancient empires of Egypt, Greece, Rome, Assyria, and Byzantium. Visitors could walk around in these really grand spaces that imitated historic metropolises and were lavishly constructed, mostly with replicas, but also incorporating some genuine ancient artifacts. The intended effect was an immersive, theatrical, and panoramic bringing to life of the supposed great civilizations of antiquity. When the new Crystal Palace opened in 1854, the British Empire was on the cusp of a period of significant expansion that would see it become the largest empire that the world has ever known, representing the peak of civilization to many who led that expansion. It was seen as a successor to the empires of the past that inspired the courts of the palace. This interpretation of the displays was perhaps implicit in the early days of the palace, but became increasingly explicit as the decades rolled on. Particular prominence was given to the Assyrian Empire, considered the origin of civilization and associated with the rise and fall of a powerful monarchy. Its biblical associations imbued it with religious resonance. The parallels between the ancient Assyrian and the contemporary British empires would not have been lost on visitors at the time. Indeed, many commentators saw in the Crystal Palace displays a cautionary tale in its depictions of monuments to empires that all ultimately collapsed into dust. While some saw a celebration of imperial power and pride, others saw a warning against the dangers of hubris and a prophetic memento mori. I quite like the idea of the Crystal Palace serving as a kind of metaphor for the British Empire, given that the empire's expansion, destabilisation, and ultimate disintegration mirror the palace's triumphant opening, followed by decline, and an unceremonious end. Because the drop-off in the palace's popularity in the latter decades of its existence was fairly steep, despite efforts to draw visitors back with special exhibitions of an overtly imperialist nature that grew larger and larger in scale. Perhaps the most disturbing episode came with the African exhibition of 1895, featuring a human exhibit of 80 people from Somalia who were put on display wearing animal skins and performing traditional dances. The 1911 Festival of Empire was a propaganda showcase on an even bigger scale, despite coming at a time when independence movements in many of Britain's colonies were gaining momentum and the foundations of the empire were starting to crack. I must credit Geoffrey Auerbach, whose article Empire Under Glass was my main source of information on the history of the palace and its imperial legacy. I'll leave you today with Geoffrey's own words. The Crystal Palace illuminates the changing place of the empire in British society and culture during the second half of the 19th century and the start of the 20th. From 1851, when industry and manufactures were the focus and the term empire was barely even in use, to the 1850s and 1860s, when the British started to see themselves as heirs to the great ancient empires, to the 1890s, when the Crystal Palace began to display the people of the empire, as colonial peoples themselves were increasingly making their way to the imperial metropolis, to 1911, when the British Empire was portrayed as a family, but where the first stirrings of colonial nationalism were evident. Beneath the surface, a continuing process of contestation and negotiation took place, as organisers, visitors and commentators, both in Britain and its colonies, struggled to articulate and refine the relationship between Britain and its empire. Thank you for watching this video, which was a lot of fun to make. Links to all the websites, articles, books, etc. that I mentioned in this video can be found in the description. Also, if you want to do this run yourself, I've made it into a route on Strava, and a link to that can also be found in the description. I hope you enjoyed watching this, and if you did, I've got another video where I go for a run and a ramble around Burgess Park, so you can go check that out. Where should I go next? Let me know. More videos definitely to come. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.